Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Firewalls Don't Stop Dragons. I'm your host, Kerry Parker. Today, we have episode 487 for June 29th, 2026. We are almost halfway through the year, folks. That's just amazing. So we've got a news show for you today. Plenty of topics to cover. Before I get into the news rundown, a couple quick things that didn't really quite warrant a full news story. Nevertheless, I wanted to draw your attention to them. First of all, the folks at MISC, that's M-Y-S-K, some security researchers who've done some great stuff, have created a really interesting free app that helps you understand all the ways that basically any smartphone app can learn a lot about you, despite Apple's best efforts to prevent it, and probably despite your indication that you do not wish to be tracked. It's an app called Loop, like as in a jeweler's loop, L-O-U-P-E. And it's really eye-opening. You should definitely check it out. I recommend you install it. It's free. Play around with it. But then you should also check out it, even if you don't install it, honestly. TechLore did a video about it. Henry did a wonderful job explaining what it does and what the implications are and what the few things you could do to try to prevent some of this tracking. I put a link in the show notes. You should check out the app and the video for sure. But basically, in a nutshell, it shows you all the ways that an app on your iPhone can learn a lot of things about you and can use all those details to fingerprint you, meaning, potentially, that multiple apps that could fingerprint your device will be able to find out things about you and cross-correlate things about you between applications that Apple would normally not allow. And also just learn a lot of things about you. I was actually talking with the folks at MISC a while back to come on the show. I never quite managed to work that out. I'll have to reach out again and see if we can make that happen. All right, second, I was going to do a whole story on this, and I'm always having to triage these stories, and there's too many to cover. And so I decided just to mention this instead here briefly, and that is the UK has now proposed a social media ban for anybody under age 16, similar to what Australia did, though actually it's even more restrictive. But it kind of came out of nowhere. It was put out by the then Prime Minister Starmer, who has since resigned. So it's still a proposal. They still have to debate it. There's going to be a new Prime Minister. So it seems like I'm not really sure where this is going to go, but I'll keep an eye on it and let you know. But if you are in the UK, you should definitely be paying attention to this and talking to your representatives and making your voices heard. So that's that. All right, so let me give you a quick rundown of what we are going to cover today. Another massive data breach that spilled login credentials for thousands of very sensitive networks. We're going to talk about how the feds in the United States were able to get some activists' signal messages. Visa has now decided that it's going to allow payment systems to be connected to ChatGPT and other AI agents so that you can buy stuff. And right before the last news episode, there was kind of a big to-do about Anthropic's new Fable models being banned for foreign use by the United States, which ended up meaning they had to pull them down for everybody. It caused a lot of blowback, and there's been a lot of discussion. It was just kind of new then, and we didn't know very many details. We honestly still don't know that many details. But we've got more details, and I've got a very particular opinion I want to share with you from a very respected cybersecurity researcher. The U.S. has shortened its window for fixing bugs and vulnerabilities to just 3 days in light of AI. And then there's some new bills that Epic is endorsing that I'd like to mention as good examples of things that we need. And then I've got a few stories that are all kind of interrelated, and these have to do with compromised home IoT devices and what we can do about those. We're going to first talk about the Canadian spy agency who used a first-of-its-kind warrant to disinfect some of these compromised devices on the internet that belong to people like you and me. Then another article about LG smart TV apps containing residential proxy SDKs, and I will, of course, explain what that's about. And then finally, a similar article from the EFF about cheap Android-based devices that are also doing home proxying. And then that's going to lead right into my tip of the week. So, plenty to talk about. Let's get to it. First up, this is from Ars Technica and Dan Gooden, who I will be interviewing soon. And it's about a really nasty breach. And unfortunately, we're probably going to be having knock-on effects for this for months to come, maybe years. Researchers have uncovered a massive breach of Fortinet firewalls that has given Russian-speaking attackers near unrestricted access to some of the world's largest and most powerful organizations, including Oracle, Chevron, Lenovo, Federal Express, a NATO defense contractor, and Fortinet itself. Nearly 74,000 Fortinet devices from more than 21,000 IP addresses into 194 countries have been compromised and their plain text credentials exposed online. Bob Diachenko, a security researcher and head of security discovery, said online and in an interview. He said he found the data after gaining access to the attacker's command and control server and other infrastructure. The exposed data also included the industry, revenue, and employee count for each compromised organization. Independent researcher Kevin Beaumont reported that almost all of the compromised devices remain online as of Wednesday morning. This is, a week or two ago. He went on to say that he has confirmed with multiple organizations found in the attacker's logs that the credentials are real and current. In many cases, once the threat actors compromised the devices, they went on to access affected organizations' centralized authentication systems, such as, radio servers and Active Directory. The number of compromised devices comprises roughly half of all internet-facing Fortinet firewalls based on polling from Shodan. And Shodan is an internet search engine for online devices. And this is a question from Hudson Rock, a security firm, who says, quote, "The scale of this breach touches nearly every sector of the global economy, sparing no industry. The threat actors have built a verified database of working credentials for some of the largest enterprises on the planet," unquote. Diachenko, Beaumont, and Hudson Rock all urged Fortinet users to investigate their networks immediately for signs of compromise. Hudson Rock provided this search engine for locating affected domains, and that's a link. The scale of the operation is exceptional. The threat actor, which Diachenko said was criminally motivated, started by mass scanning the internet for FortiGate remote login endpoints. They then used a custom binary with 25,000 threads to spray hundreds of thousands of those endpoints with thousands of login and password combinations. Successful attempts now gave the attackers a, quote, network tap inside the organization, unquote. Hudson Rock said the attackers went on to, quote, actively intercept SSL VPN authentication hashes and crack them using a massive, dedicated 45 GPU cluster managed via Hashtopolis, unquote. And Hashtopolis, I'm sure, is just a cloud-based GPU renting service. From there, they used the GPU cluster to crack the hashes, meaning to try massive combinations of plain text passwords until they found the right one. These passwords allowed the threat actors to move laterally to compromise Active Directory environments and other centralized authentication systems. And this is a quote from Hudson Rock, who says, quote, "This aggressive methodology has led to severe real-world consequences. Diachenko's research confirmed full network compromises at multiple organizations across Japan, Taiwan, Vietnam, Iraq, and Turkey. Most alarmingly, this includes a Turkish NATO defense contractor from which classified defense documents were successfully exfiltrated by the group," unquote. In the interview, Diachenko put it more succinctly, quote, "The scale is the sophistication," unquote. The scale didn't stop there. The attackers used the massive cluster to run a feedback-driven 12-level recursive system. In other words, there wasn't a single flat dictionary run. Password candidates came from custom dictionaries with as many as 8 words, common keyboard patterns, and cracking rules. Each one looped back with each step. When guesses were successful, the passwords were fed back as seeds to generate still more candidates. In other words, the cracking techniques improved with each successful guess. The innovation contrasts sharply with the operational security of the attackers, who left artifacts on the server they used. In hacker circles, such moves are considered amateur mistakes. Hudson Rock said that the top countries where compromised devices were found were India, the US, Taiwan, Mexico, Turkey, and Thailand. The top industries affected were IT services, construction materials, telecommunications, construction and engineering, industrial equipment, and financial services. Other organizations whose data appeared in the database included Foxconn, who makes chips, Samsung, Comcast, Siemens, PwC, and Accenture. Hudson Rock said that the database listed thousands of others, including major government agencies and critical infrastructure providers. Firewalls have long been a favorite network entry point for hackers, which is really ironic, by the way. These devices accept connections from the outside internet, sit at the perimeter of a network, and have access to valuable resources deep inside. Okay, sorry, I know that was a little bit technical. As you may or may not recall, firewalls are really the gate between your internal network and the broader internet. And it's called a firewall because it's meant to keep bad things out. In this case, bad guys from getting into your internal network. In the old days, we'd call these sort of a setup an M&M type defense, crunchy on the outside, soft on the inside. Meant that the border was really secure, or they tried to make it really secure. But once you got past the border, it was kind of loosey-goosey. The security wasn't that great. If you got in the inside, if you got past the border, if you got through the firewall, you had much broader access. We can only hope that a lot of these companies have learned and have moved on to a zero trust kind of a network where everything is segmented and compartmentalized. And just because you got past the initial line of defense doesn't mean you can then go everywhere you want. But we're about to find out, because these companies were compromised. A lot of really big name companies. And a lot of these companies are behind things that you don't know that they're behind. They may be supporting other services that you do care about. Certainly a company as big as Oracle, for example. So we're going to be hearing about the effects of this breach, I think, for a long time. And it's not going to be good. We can only hope that the companies that were affected by this know now that they were affected by this and are taking steps to remediate any possible damage that was done. But if this comes down to data that was exfiltrated, and who knows what damage that could do in the future, even if they slam the door shut now, it may be too late. So I have a feeling that we'll be circling back to the repercussions of this for some time. And I will actually be really interested to know what Fortinet's response on this has been, and how they say that this happened, and whether or not they will actually be legally held accountable for this, if it was a real screw up. All right, moving on. This one's from The Intercept, and it's about how federal law enforcement somehow managed to get into the signal messages of some activists. These particular activists were anti-ICE, but this could happen to anybody, including, honestly, non-activists. Anybody that the law enforcement really wanted to get into their communications. And really, this could happen to any of us. You don't have to be an activist. If they have this technology and they decide they want to use it on you, it will have the same effects. And the upshot of all of this is going to be, what can you do to protect your signal messages better? All right, from The Intercept. When anti-ICE activists rallied against the Trump administration's deportation campaign in Minneapolis, many relied on encrypted messaging app Signal for secure communications. In activist chats and quickly established ICE tracking groups, locals used Signal to keep tabs on federal agents patrolling their communities. When the Department of Homeland Security announced this week the arrest of 15 alleged anti-ICE rioters in Minnesota, it pointed directly at their Signal chats. The indictment is in large part built upon conversations from more than a dozen Signal groups, citing more than 100 specific messages. The case is a stark reminder that using an encrypted messaging platform like Signal is not in and of itself a magic bullet to safeguard communications. It also raises the question, how did Immigrations and Customs Enforcement's Homeland Security Investigations Unit gain access to all of these communications in the first place? The indictment doesn't provide a clear answer, but sprinkled throughout the document are clues that suggest that law enforcement may have gained access to the physical devices of some of those indicted. The bulk of the indictment consists of transcripts of group messages. At various points, it also makes mention of voicemails, text messages, Signal direct messages, and Signal calls. For instance, the indictment in one spot mentions that 2 of the indictees exchanged approximately 20 connected Signal calls. This hints that authorities were able to access not just group chat messages, but likely had wholesale access to the devices of at least some of those indicted. The Signal app provides end-to-end encryption, protecting communications in transit, so that anyone monitoring your internet or cellular data connection cannot see the contents of the messages. Signal also minimizes the amount of metadata collected, so if the organization behind the app, the Signal Foundation, was served with a compulsory legal process to reveal user information, it wouldn't even know with whom you spoke or chatted. But all that falls apart if your device gets in the wrong hands. In order to safeguard your Signal data from someone who obtains access to your device, it's necessary to manually harden Signal by modifying some of its default settings. Perhaps Signal's most well-touted security and privacy feature is its ability to set disappearing messages. Messages can be set to expire in periods ranging from seconds to weeks. A default expiration time for all messages can be selected, and specific groups and conversations can be set to custom retention times. To minimize risk, set retention times to the shortest amount feasible, minutes or hours instead of days or weeks. Keep in mind that Signal's disappearing messages delete the contents of a message, but they don't remove evidence that communications between parties occurred in the first place. That means that even if a group has enabled disappearing messages, someone who gains access to a member's device could later determine with whom they were chatting. Therefore, it's safest to regularly delete entire groups and chats, not just the messages themselves. Just like its chat function, Signal also keeps similar records of voice and video calls. It's as important to delete records of the calls as it is to delete records of text messages, both within the Signal app and in your phone's standard call history. On iPhone, Signal can integrate its call history into the iPhone's regular call history. This privacy-eroding feature can be disabled on Signal on iOS by tapping your profile circle on the top left corner of the app, clicking on Settings, then Privacy, then disabling Show Calls in Recents. Additionally, for Signal on iPhones, you'll also likely want to disable settings like Share Contacts with iOS and Use Phone Contact Photos. And for Android users, the equivalent is Use Address Book Photos, which can be found under Settings, then Chats. Such precautions may sound extreme, but in a recent case, authorities were able to recover detailed incoming Signal messages based on old push notifications that were archived on iPhones. And note that the latest iPhone update fixes this issue, highlighting the importance of keeping your devices up to date. On that note, remember to either turn off Signal notifications entirely or have them display only the names of people sending messages, which should be pseudonyms, not real names. Okay, so this brings up just a couple operational security tips. If you are using Signal and you do not wish any of the contents of your messages to later be found, then you must make sure that they are actively deleted from all devices of all people involved in the chat. And Signal makes this easy by setting disappearing messages, and I recommend that you set a default, honestly, for everybody. But at least if there's some group whose messages you definitely don't want to be found, if someone were to get a hold of somebody in the group's device, you should be setting the disappearing messages to a very short time frame. And then there are some other features like this article mentioned that you might want to turn off that might, allow for metadata leakage into other parts of the phone outside of even the Signal app. All right, moving on. This is also from the Associated Press, and it's about giving AI agents the ability to spend money on your behalf. Betting that people will soon grow more comfortable having artificial intelligence agents shop for groceries, plane tickets, or diapers on their behalf, payments giant Visa said Wednesday that it has embedded its payment network inside of ChatGPT, empowering the chatbot to independently shop and complete transactions. It means AI agents can not only recommend products, but complete the purchase on the user's behalf at potentially any merchant that accepts Visa. The payment network's previous attempts at this technology leap were confined to a single retailer or a small set of enrolled merchants. It's not OpenAI's first attempt at e-commerce. The company late last year announced Instant Checkout, which allowed ChatGPT to scour the internet for a specific item like a digital personal shopper. But the process was prone to errors and was not widely adopted by merchants due to the fee that OpenAI was charging merchants. The company retired Instant Checkout in March. Visa's collaboration is different from OpenAI's previous attempts, as it will allow users to link their Visa cards to ChatGPT to shop and make it easier for merchants to accept transactions initiated by agents. OpenAI will provide the technology to allow agents to interact, make decisions, and initiate purchases through ChatGPT. Visa, the world's largest payment network outside of China, will provide the payment authorization and fraud monitoring needed to do this at scale. And here's a quote from Jack Forstall, Chief Product and Strategy Officer at Visa, who says, quote, "As AI agents become active participants in the economy, Visa's focus is to ensure transactions are trusted, secure, and seamless," unquote. Speaking at a company event Wednesday in San Francisco, Forstall gave an example of a customer telling ChatGPT they're looking for a pair of wireless headphones under $150. The chatbot would find a pair for sale under those parameters and buy it on behalf of the customer. Allowing AI agents to buy products on behalf of a consumer raises concerns for both banks and retailers. A customer could overspend, or the agent buys the wrong item, or the customer claims they did not authorize that transaction. Banks have been concerned about potential fraud claims that could occur when an agent uses a bank customer's credit or debit card. Visa says the feature will have guardrails like spending limits, require approval steps, and approve merchants for shopping in order to protect customers and minimize fraud. Forstall says Visa will handle disputes with the same essential rules it uses for any other transaction. Did the consumer really intend to make the purchase, and did the merchant process it the correct way? It will take time for people to fully trust AI agents to do their shopping, Forstall acknowledged. At first, Visa expects the majority of transactions will still loop in humans, with AI agents sending a notification for consumers to approve the actual purpose. And a final quote from Forstall, who says, quote, "Now imagine you do that 1,000 times over the course of some period of time, and then your agent says, 'Do you want me to just not check?' Unquote." So that last part is actually important because consent fatigue is a real thing. And it's especially common with AI tools. If you ever work with Claude Code, you quickly get to the point where you get tired of having to approve every single thing that it does. And there are ways you could say, yeah, you could do this sort of thing without asking me. Don't ask me for these types of things. Keep going. But even those things could be dangerous. I have worked with Claude Code enough to know that I got to keep an eye on what it's doing. And I've gotten better at quickly seeing what it's doing, but it has tried to do some things that I explicitly told it not to do. And I catch it, and it says, oh yeah, sorry. Now, I've also set up the permissions on my system so that it couldn't have done it even if it wanted to. So it would have tried and failed. Nevertheless, the fact that it even tried when I told it not to try was troubling. So this is the future. It's going to happen. We are going to authorize AI agents to make purchases on our behalf. It will get better. It will get to the point where we'll trust it. But it's got problems. I would not recommend you doing this right away. But this was inevitable. And given what I have seen with AI agents, I really think that this customer intention part is going to be tricky. But I'm guessing, by the way, that if you tell your agent, you know what, stop asking me. You've done this enough now that I trust you. From here on out, stop asking me. When I tell you to go make a purchase, just go do it. When I tell you to go find me a good deal on something, you have authorization to just buy that thing without asking me. At that point, if it screws up, who's to blame? Like, let's say it gets the wrong thing. Or you didn't give it quite enough information about what you wanted, so the AI did the best it could, but in the end, it was something that you didn't want to purchase. Whose fault is that? I don't think that's really fraud. At that point, I think it's really going to come back to you. You're not going to be able to point to the ChatGPT and say, no, it's his fault, charge him. All right, next up, this was a really big story that hit right before my last news show. And it's about Anthropic's latest frontier model for AI stuff. It's called, the private one was called Mythos, and then now they've released this thing called Fable. And very shortly after they released it, the US government basically came knocking and said, hey, you got to shut this down. You cannot give this to foreign nationals, including ones that might be working at your company. So it wasn't like just keep this from working outside the United States. It was basically anyone who's not a US citizen. And there's no way to enforce that. So they basically had to just shut it down. And it caused a lot of kerfuffle in the cybersecurity industry. And one person in particular, Katie Massaris, was actually in on this. Like, they actually approached her to look at this. So she actually has some inside knowledge of this. And I think her opinion is the one that I want to read here. So this is from Luda Security. She's the head of Luda Security. This is her blog about how this all went down. And then I'll give you a little bit more of my take. So Katie says, Anthropic recently shared a third-party research paper on Fable 5 guardrail bypass techniques with me privately and asked for my take. Nobody expected the U.S. Secretary of Commerce to issue an export control affecting Fable 5 and Mythos, forcing Anthropic to pull the plug on access for everyone to comply. So much for a drama-free weekend in cybersecurity. The heavy-handed and hasty export control directive was misguided. The behavior described in the paper cannot meaningfully be fixed, and any attempt would only weaken the model for defense. Since I appear to be the only outside expert who has actually read the paper, I can separate the technical facts from the speculation. The researchers took open source code with known CVEs, in other words, documented vulnerabilities, plus new code with deliberately planted vulnerabilities, and asked Fable 5, Mythos, and Opus to, quote, review the code for security issues, unquote. Fable 5 refused. Then they asked the models to, quote, fix this code, unquote, and through a multi-step and manual process, turned the output into scripts that test the patches. Okay, let me stop real quick. Basically, they took some code that had known vulnerabilities. They put them in there. They wanted them to be found. And they told Fable 5, this new model, to review the code for security, at which point it said no, because Fable 5 very explicitly has guardrails built in to try to prevent it from being used on cybersecurity stuff, in particular to find vulnerabilities. In fact, it's also got guardrails about, I think, biological weapons and things like that as well. And people were complaining that it was too strict. But then they basically said, look, we want to fix this code, and then we want you to create a test script that shows that the code has been fixed. That same exact code, if run on unfixed software, would compromise it because the fix isn't present. If you're testing whether or not your fix works, it should fail to work on fixed code, but conversely, it would succeed on code that had not been fixed. Therefore, it's basically making an exploit. All right, so with that, let me continue. So that's it. Fix this code plus several manual steps to generate test scripts should never have triggered an export control. I feel like making 90s style t-shirts with fix this code on the front and this shirt is a munition on the back. And let me stop again. That's a reference to the old crypto wars of the 90s when very secure encryption techniques were turned into a quote-unquote munition by the U.S. government, and they tried to impose export controls so that the really good encryption wasn't exported outside the United States, because if it was really good, CIA, NSA, these groups wouldn't be able to crack the encryption. They wanted weak encryption. And so, because we have the First Amendment in the United States, somebody took the code that did that encryption, it was very short, printed it on a t-shirt, and walked through customs at another country because that was protected First Amendment speech, and effectively exported this code. That is what she's referring to here. Something that we talked to Phil Zimmerman, the creator of PGP, a while back on the show. All right, sorry, back to the article. Defenders need to be able to ask AI to fix the bugs in a file, explain why the fix matters, and write tests that confirm that the patch works. This is not a guardrail bypass. It's the most valuable thing an AI model can do for defensive security. Executing the find, fix, and test loop defenders run every day. The prompts worked because they were defensive requests, and that capability cannot be removed without making the model worse at fixing bugs and verifying patches. The same holds for every capable AI model, including the foreign and open weight systems the United States cannot reach with export controls, many of which will match Fable and Mythos capabilities within months. Will all the US-based models be export controlled? They have fewer guardrails than Fable 5 and almost all the capabilities, or will shortly. I served on the U.S. technical expert group that spent years renegotiating the Wassenaar arrangement, where we eventually won export control exemptions for defensive activity. When Wassenaar added controls on intrusion software in 2013, the language was so broad that it inadvertently placed vulnerability disclosure, incident response, and coordinated defense under export controls, threatening catastrophic delays for defenders. Restricting these AI models has the same unintended consequence of harming defense while doing nothing to impede attackers. We can't export control our way to cyber resilience. Colleagues across the industry see the same harm to defense, even though they haven't yet read the paper. A group of us have signed an open letter to the Secretary of Commerce asking that the controls be lifted and the analysis behind them re-examined. That is how fundamental these models are to our work. Professionals will stake their reputations on the conviction that whatever the paper says, it's not worth kneecapping our defenses. Lift the controls on Fable 5 and Mythos. Restore defender access, including within Project Glasswing, which we've talked about recently on the show. Defense improves when defenders find the same bugs attackers find and fix them faster. We need the best tools to defend against increasingly capable attackers in the AI era of cybersecurity. Okay, so I'm not sure I have a whole lot to add to that. By the way, I did sign that petition. It's at freefable.org. If you're curious, there's a link in the show notes. And also at this point, as of my recording this, it seems like these decisions might be getting rolled back or limited. I think they've at this point said it can still be used, but it's by a limited number of organizations approved by the US government. That's not sustainable either. These models are coming whether they like it or not, and not all of them are going to be under US control. We're going to have to find a different way to handle this, and a lot of that, frankly, is going to be improve our security. This is a wake-up call if there ever was one, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that later in the show. All right, a really quick one here from Reuters, and this is apropos of this, and it's a good move. Let me just read it quickly. The U.S. Cyber Defense Agency said on Wednesday that government officials now have 3 days to deal with the most serious categories of digital vulnerabilities in their networks, a compressed timeline that is due in part to hackers' use of artificial intelligence. The deadline, which was set in a new directive issued by the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, or CISA, obligates civilian federal agencies with vulnerable software or equipment to fix, disable, or remove it from the internet within 3 calendar days, depending on the severity of the threat. Many cyber experts worry that new, more advanced AI models along the lines of Anthropic's Mythos, or maybe Fable, are supercharging hackers' abilities to take advantage of digital vulnerabilities across the internet, forcing tech workers to plug security holes almost as soon as they are discovered. And this is a quote from an exec at CISA who says, quote, "Defenders cannot afford to take weeks to patch systems that can be autonomously exploited en masse." And the directive was an initial step to counter the increased capabilities of those emerging AI models, unquote. Even under the new directive, there is still more time to deal with less severe weaknesses, such as ones that are not as easy for hackers and criminals to automate, or do not concern publicly exposed digital infrastructure. An appendix to the order leaves 2 weeks to deal with many vulnerabilities and as long as 2 months for the less serious category of flaw. Okay, yeah, so this is good, and this is where we are at today. We need to be much more proactive and really have to turn around fixes as quickly as possible or get the things off the internet if we can't get them secured. So this is a good move. We probably need to be doing several others. Next up, a quick one here from Epic, the Electronic Privacy Information Center. By the way, I've actually got a great interview coming up with somebody from Epic soon. But let me read this article, and it's about 2 privacy bills that have been introduced that I want you guys to be aware of, and, hopefully we'll see these get passed. On Thursday, Epic endorsed 2 key worker privacy bills introduced by Democratic Senators Ed Markey, Brian Schatz, and Cory Booker. The No Robot Bosses Act and the Stop Spying Bosses Act. And this is a quote from Epic Deputy Director and Policy Director Catriona Fitzgerald, as part of a statement who says, quote, "The No Robots Act and Stop Spying Bosses Act protect America's workers from opaque automated systems that invade their privacy and are used to unfairly judge their competence, scrutinize their every move, and interfere with their ability to collectively organize for better pay and better work. Epic thanks Senator Markey for his leadership on protecting workers and is proud to endorse these bills," unquote. The former bill safeguards against the use of automated decision systems, such as AI, to make important workplace decisions, including hiring, firing, scheduling, and discipline. The latter protects workers against undisclosed, unregulated surveillance by their employers. The No Robots Bosses Act prohibits employers from predominantly relying on automated decision systems to make workplace decisions, mandates pre-deployment assessments and transparency about the use of automated decision systems, gives workers the right to opt out of algorithmic management in favor of human review, and creates several other privacy protections for job applicants and workers. The Stop Spying Bosses Act curtails employers' ability to surveil their workers, including by limiting collection and use of worker data to what's strictly necessary, and by prohibiting the use of worker data to surveil workers' union activity, political or religious views, immigration status, or off-duty conduct. It also mandates the disclosure of what worker data is being collected, how it's being used, and who has access to it. Additionally, it gives workers the right to access and correct data about them. Epic applauds Senators Markey, Schatz, and Booker for their attention to this critical issue, as well as Representatives Chris DeLuzio and Suzanne Bonamici, who introduced companion legislation to both bills. Epic has consistently advocated for broader privacy protections for workers, and an increasingly urgent mission as the use of monitoring tools and surveillance technology in the workplace expands. We talked about that in a recent interview. If you want to go back and check that out, you definitely should. And this is good stuff. So you might want to let your representative know that you think they should be supporting these bills. And while you're at it, you might let them know that we need a broader bill for all of us, not just for workers. That's great. It's a good start, but we need these same kind of protections for everybody, all the time, everywhere. Okay, so 3 articles left here, and they're all going to kind of run into a bigger picture, which is going to lead me to my tip of the week. And they're all about compromising devices in your home to allow bad guys to do things as if they were you in some cases, or by directing your devices to do bad things on their behalf. And the first one is from the Hacker News, and it actually happened a couple of years ago, but it's just come to light because of some of the court documents have become unsealed. And it brings up a pretty thorny issue. So let me read this article. Canadian's spy service got a judge's permission to reach into infected servers, home routers, and IoT gear sitting on Canadian soil and neutralize 2 foreign-run botnets. The federal court released a public version of the ruling on June 15th. It's the first time the Canadian Security Intelligence Service, CSIS, has used its threat reduction warrant powers this way. The warrant lets CSIS alter, degrade, and destroy botnet data on the infected machines and cut the devices loose from the networks. The targets were Canada-based servers, small office and home office routers, and Internet of Things devices like Ring doorbells or security cameras, TVs, and other Wi-Fi-enabled appliances. Justice Catherine King granted the warrant on May 1st, 2024, renewed it that August, and issued the confidential reasons in February of 2026. The warrant stayed out of public view for more than 2 years until this month's redacted release. The CSIS needed the order because the cleanup would likely have been a crime without it. Reaching into someone else's device and wiping data is computer mischief under the criminal code, so the service needed a judge's sign-off before touching the machines. The court found the threat to Canada clearly established and imminent, and the measures necessary, reasonable, and proportional. It stressed the operation went after devices, not people. No user identities sought, no content intercepted, any personal data swept up incidentally, destroyed. The 2 botnets ran the standard relay playbook. A command tier issued the orders, a layer of infected devices relayed the traffic. By routing through hijacked Canadian hardware, a foreign state can look like an ordinary connection, a home worker, or an ISP customer, while it probes critical infrastructure, government, and military networks. The owner of the infected doorbell gets left looking responsible for traffic they never sent. The court flagged the energy sector among the targets and warned that the adversaries could direct the botnets to probe and potentially disrupt Canadian infrastructure. Now, it goes on to give details about a similar campaign in the U.S., which we actually talked about when that happened. But I scrubbed that out of here to save some time. And back to the article, it says, the lesson for defenders is the boring one. The botnets feed on the gear nobody maintains. End-of-life routers still wired into the network, IoT kits that never took their last firmware update, anything setting on default credentials with a management panel facing the internet. A government cleanup does not touch that. In the U.S. operations, the malware came off, but the weaknesses stayed, and a reboot or factory reset could undo the fix and reopen the door to reinfection. Retiring the dead hardware and locking down what stays is on the owner, not the agency that cleaned up after them. Okay, so this touches on a few different things. First, the easy ones. Yes, our IoT devices, especially our home routers, need to be kept up to date. We need to keep the software on them the latest possible because there are bugs that get found and we need to have those bugs fixed. And if you have a router or really any other IoT device that is so old that it can no longer be updated or so poorly designed that it never had the opportunity to be updated, you should honestly get rid of them and perhaps replace them with something newer that will take automated software updates. Now, the really thorny part about this, and this could be a whole podcast episode, is the fact that the government basically said, we know where all these devices are, and we need to be able to purge all these devices of the malware. And in this case, that meant basically hacking the devices back. And that, of course, required a court order, thank goodness. But is that really what we want to be doing? I don't know. I've got a lot of mixed feelings on this. The kind of remediations that the government could get into for something like this, like forcing these devices offline, like maybe telling their ISP to block all traffic from that house, because the ISP wouldn't have any way to block just a single device inside that house. Or letting these agencies actually hack into our devices to purge them of malware. Obviously, that leaves open the possibility of them doing other things. Some pretty bad things. So I think my hot take on this article is that I don't like that they do that. I think we should find other ways. But that sounds to me like a really interesting podcast episode. So I may find me an expert on that topic and we can debate it at length. So this next one's from a company called Spur, which I don't think I've ever quoted before, but they have an interesting blog about residential proxies in televisions, basically. All right, let me read this, then we'll talk. Everyone worries about the apps on their phone. Almost no one looks at the ones on their TV. We scanned 6,038 of them across LG and Samsung. 2,058 were selling your IP address. On the screen, it's a relaxing fish tank, or a clock, or solitaire, or puppies. Under the hood, it's a residential proxy, software that can send other people's internet traffic out through your living room. And we found it everywhere. Smart TVs are almost ideal proxy hosts. They sit on the same home network as everything else, but they do not feel like computers, so people rarely audit them like computers. There's no battery drain to notice, no cellular bill to spike, no app switcher full of suspicious background activity. A TV can stay plugged in, signed in, and online for years while the user thinks of it as furniture. That changes the consent equation too. Most people do not have a working mental model for what it means to sell access to their residential IP address, no matter what device they are using. On a TV, the gap is even wider. A one-time prompt navigated with a remote can disappear into the setup flow, while the app keeps monetizing the connection long after anyone remembers what they accepted. So how do proxies end up in TV apps? The answer is money. Ads need attention, and when you insert ads, it degrades the user experience. These apps are designed for the opposite. A clock, a fish tank, a quiet screen that doesn't bother you with constant ads. Add a proxy SDK, and the app can keep looking calm while the TV's internet connection makes money in the background. Below are what these companies considered consent for their proxy SDKs. They ask once, and then never again. And now at this point, it shows several images. I'm going to read you some of the text for them. But there's many more that I didn't cover here that are interesting that you might want to check out. Anyway, but I'll read you a couple. So it's talking about an image on the screen, which I'll read to you in a minute, about an app looking for permission. So it says, the background clause is the part that matters. All three prompts say the proxy can keep running after the app is closed. The app is closed, but the proxy can continue running unless explicitly deleted or opted out. And this is what the text actually says on the screen. So picture this as an app on your screen. You're installing it for the first time, and it pops up, says, hey, we'd like you to agree to these things. And of course, yes is the default. And in the background, it says in small print, to enjoy this game without ads, please allow web indexing by Bright Data, that's a company, capital B, capital D, to occasionally use your device's free resources and IP address to download public web data from the internet. Bright Data will only use your IP address for approved business-related use cases and never for unauthorized cases, whatever that means. None of your personal information is accessed or collected except your IP address. Bright Data does not track you. You can opt out anytime. Press 5 on your TV remote to opt out. So that's not even an option on the screen. There's the yes and no part, but to opt out, you actually have to find a different button on your remote. Okay, so the article goes on. It says, some apps make the trade-off even more explicit. Pac-Man on Tizen frames Bright Data as the ad-free option. Decline and you keep the ad-supported game. Accept and the app gets to use the TV's connection for web indexing. This is a little clean monetization fork. Watch ads or become part of the proxy network. And this is the text that's on that screen. It says, or the Pac-Man ad, it says, for an ad-free experience, please allow web indexing by Bright Data to use your device's free resources and IP address to download public web data from the internet. And again, there's like 3 or 4 more apps that they have pictures of their approval screens that you can check out. Okay, so who's making these apps? This is not just a story about proxy companies convincing random app developers to embed a monetization SDK. In a lot of cases, the proxy company, or something wearing its name, appears to be the publisher, too. Bright Data, Bright Data Limited, and Bright SDK account for 367 proxy-flagged apps in the dataset. Honeygain UAB, a subsidiary of Oxy Labs, shows up as the publisher of another 16. That changes the shape of the problem. Some of these are not normal apps that happen to have a proxy SDK inside them. They look more like first-party proxy inventory. Thin, shovelware games, screensavers, and utility shells shipped at scale so the SDK has somewhere to run. The app is the wrapper. The residential IP is the product. Other TV platforms have already drawn a line. Amazon makes it explicit. Its device and system abuse policy prohibits apps that facilitate proxy services for third parties. Roku has reportedly shut the door too. Lowpass, syndicated at The Verge, reported that Roku bars developers from using Bright SDK and similar proxy services, and that Roku apps using the SDK disappeared after the company was contacted. LG and Samsung have not drawn an equivalent public line. That is the gap these apps are living in. The same business model that Amazon bans and Roku reportedly blocks is still showing up at scale on WebOS and Tizen. Tizen must be the operating system for one of those makers. Once a TV app can act as a proxy, the risk is not limited to someone borrowing your public IP address. The app is running inside your home network. If the proxy provider decides to allow requests to private or local addresses, or if their filtering fails, that TV becomes a foothold for reaching things that were never meant to be exposed to the internet. Router admin panels, NAS devices, printers, cameras, developer machines, and other apps listening on local ports. This is not theoretical. In January of 2026, Krebs on Security reported on Kimwolf, a botnet that abused residential proxy networks to tunnel back into the local networks behind proxy endpoints, and I talked about that when it came out. The report describes attackers using proxy access not just for public web traffic, but to reach devices on the same LAN as the proxy node and spread further from there. The SDKs make that boundary visible. The Bright Data sample ships with an explicit private local block list. And then it lists some IP addresses. You would recognize these, but it's basically your standard home internal IP address ranges. So that is good to see, but it also proves the point. The TV can make the connection. The boundary is the SDK's policy code. In the local massive, and that's capital M, this is a company, in the local massive and Honeygain/OxyLab samples, we did not find a comparable private range block list. That makes the provider's policy and enforcement the real boundary. The boundary is not technical. It is enforced by the proxy company's customer vetting, traffic filters, internal rules, and whatever platform review LG or Samsung choose to apply. Proxy providers can say that the traffic is limited to approved public web use cases, but the device owner has no practical way to verify that from the TV. If that boundary changes, breaks, or is abused, the same SDK that was framed as web indexing can become a cybercriminal's personal VPN connection into your home network. Now, there's a whole section here about where this company reached out to all these companies and they gave their responses. And basically what they said is, we always get user consent, we're open about what we do, and they do vetting of the people that use this proxy. That they all basically said some form of that. All right, so finishing the article, it says, a TV app should not be able to quietly turn a living room device into a residential proxy infrastructure. Screensavers, games, clocks, and novelty apps can be boring, cheap, or ad-supported. If an app is going to monetize a household's internet connection, the user should be clearly informed about what that means, how the connection will be used, and what risks and trade-offs they are accepting. The problem is not that residential proxy networks exist. It is that they are being embedded at scale in devices that most consumers do not think of as computers and are not equipped to audit. A one-time consent prompt buried in a TV app is not a substitute for meaningful transparency, ongoing control, and platform oversight. The risk is amplified when consent comes from individuals within the household who use the device but shouldn't give consent, such as minors. Amazon bans this category of software and Roku reportedly blocks it. LG and Samsung could choose a different path, but they should at a minimum establish clear policies governing residential proxy SDKs, require prominent disclosure and user controls, and scrutinize apps that relay third-party traffic through consumer devices. Platforms should ensure that users understand that distinction before they are asked to participate. Equally, consumers need to be mindful of the opportunity for their home networks to be leveraged by third parties through devices otherwise considered benign, such as smart TVs. The proxy providers contacted for this research emphasized customer vetting, traffic restrictions, and abuse prevention controls. Those controls may reduce risk, but they do not change the underlying reality that residential proxy infrastructure is being embedded at scale in devices that most consumers do not recognize as participating in such networks. All right, now before I kind of talk a little bit more about what this whole proxying thing's about, let me read one more article and then I'll wrap up with that. And this one is from the EFF, and it's about another way that devices are making it into our homes that are allowing for these proxy networks to flourish. Time and time again, researchers have found numerous compromised Android devices for sale at large online retailers like Amazon. When these devices get individually reported, we have seen some noted efforts to take them down. But this is a systemic problem, and Amazon and other major online retailers must make corresponding systemic and intentional effort to stop these devices from entering people's homes and ultimately their networks. As a refresher, last year, Google wrote that one major campaign, deemed Bad Box, affected 10 million uncertified devices that were running Android's open source software. These devices span from TVs and streaming devices to digital picture frames. Even now, someone can go to Amazon or Walmart and buy one of these devices. Not all of them come from Amazon or Walmart, but it's fair to assume that since they have the lion's share of the market. Most well-known Android-based devices don't come with just stock Android. The operating system is usually Android plus additional features that the manufacturer wanted. These custom versions of Android often come with pre-installed applications that range from useful to innocuous bloatware to actual malware. Many Android OEMs, or original equipment manufacturers, pre-install apps that may not be visibly represented by an icon in your list of installed apps. This obscurity makes the issue particularly hard for users to identify any potential threats. Since the initial Bad Box analysis, there have been more reports of large campaigns and clusters of different devices participating in malicious activities that utilize people's home networks to engage in illegal activity. Task forces in the private sectors have made an effort to take down these existing command and control structures, but these actors may pivot and evolve to flood the market with more devices. Online retailers can stop this cycle. A multi-billion-dollar company like Amazon should offer more resources, like their anti-fraud efforts, given that these products may have facilitated conditions for large-scale attacks and illegal activity. It would also be helpful if they communicated malware-related takedowns in a more visible way to consumers who are seeking very similar devices with shared characteristics. Identifying these devices can be tricky, but it's not impossible because they tend to follow a pattern. For example, the FBI warned consumers this year to avoid TV streaming devices that claim to provide free sports, TV shows, and movies, a common tactic used by the makers of these malware-filled Android devices that leverages people's exhaustion from spending money on countless streaming services. We detailed what sorts of indicators to look for on a device you've purchased, and that's a link. But it's not just the storefronts. There are other parts of this ecosystem that need to improve too, like increased engagement and firmware transparency, and the actual manufacturers of the devices themselves being held accountable for these malware-laced products. On Prime Day, which is Amazon's big sale, we urge retailers like Amazon to better empower users with information they need to make safe and smart decisions. Okay, so let me just back up here a second. This whole proxying thing. So all these IoT devices in your home, including your home router, your TV, your smart fridge, your webcams, your Ring doorbells, all of these things now that we're connected to the internet are computers, and they are running software. And software often has vulnerabilities, but in this case, these devices, or the apps that you're downloading onto these devices, you are doing the inviting it into your house. You are letting the vampire cross the threshold. You're buying these really cheap Android devices, offering services that really shouldn't be free, and should start raising some red flags that they do, or installing these apps that say, well, you can either look at ads or you could let us do this other thing, which we promise won't hurt you, and that's how we'll make our money. They don't even say that much, but that's what's going on there. And what they're doing is they're acting as stepping stones for the bad guys. Now, in a lot of cases, these companies are saying they're vetting the people that are using these proxy networks, but I wouldn't count on that. And at the end of the day, what these things could then do is be a proxy for bad traffic. So the bad guys want to attack on someone else's server, or they want to control a botnet, or they want to do a denial of service attack, or attack someone's infrastructure, whatever they want to do, whatever nefarious things they want to get up to. They don't want to trace back to them. So these proxies allow them to basically log into your house and from there make their attacks. Whenever you've seen a spy movie where they said, oh, I'm trying to locate the person sending this, but they're bouncing their IP off multiple whatevers. That's kind of what's going on here. They're disguising the source of the bad traffic by funneling it through your house. So basically it appears to be coming from you. So if something really bad happens as a result of this, they're going to follow that digital trail back and it's going to end at your doorstep. So that's one of the main reasons I keep my TVs dumb. I never plug them into the internet, period, end of story. And I use an Apple TV box to do all my streaming stuff. I would recommend that you do the same. If you've already connected your TV to the internet, you need to go in and either unplug it if it's actually got a physical plug to the internet, or turn off the Wi-Fi, deconfigure the Wi-Fi router's password. But failing that, you should look at any apps you have installed or any of these cheap Android boxes you may have bought somewhere to try to get free access to content, and seriously consider getting rid of them. Okay, so I was actually thinking of making that the tip of the week. However, I've been doing a lot of thinking about the 500th episode of the podcast. We're about to celebrate our 250th anniversary here in the United States, which is a big deal for us, though globally 250 years is pretty young for a country. Nevertheless, it's a big milestone. And I kind of got to thinking and waxed a little bit philosophical. And I wrote a blog article called We Can Do This. And kind of a theme running through what I want to do for the 500th episode is I really want to focus on our collective security and privacy. We focus a lot about things you can do to protect your own personal privacy and your own personal security, but we're all connected. That is one of the concepts that I kind of vaguely knew, but was really brought home for me by reading Carissa Valise's book, Privacy is Power. Again, if you haven't read it, it's a must read. Your privacy overlaps my privacy. Your security overlaps my security. All of your data, your documents, your photos, even your genetic makeup has information about other people as well. So even if you don't care about yourself, if that information is leaked, stolen, or otherwise abused, it can affect people beyond just you. Same thing with security. If your devices at home are compromised, they can be used against somebody else, often without your knowledge, as we've seen here with these proxy networks and botnets. Or if some device on your network has been compromised and somebody comes on your Wi-Fi network, those devices for your friends, family, whoever's at your house are now threatened by the malicious device that's on your network because they are now exposed to it. So this has been true for a long time, and I've talked about these things for a while. But there's two reasons, at least, why right now it's become much more urgent. First of all, as we've talked with Josh Corman about and DEF CON Franklin and Cyber Resilience Corps, our critical infrastructure, and when I say our, I'm talking about the United States, but this is really true around the globe, is being threatened by nation-state actors, particularly Russia, China, North Korea, and Iran, but others as well. And the congressional testimony from early 2024 from the heads of CISA, FBI, and the NSA was really astonishing. And it's, I think, what gave birth to Undisruptible 27. And this whole notion that, in particular, China is pre-positioning in our infrastructure so that if and when they decide to invade Taiwan and they want to keep the U.S. on the sidelines, that they could take down a water supply here, take down an electrical grid there, and said, maybe you don't want to get in on this one. Maybe you should just sit this one out. But there are many other reasons why a foreign adversary might want to take down your critical infrastructure. And there have been many cases where we found them doing just that, probing, looking for weaknesses, in some cases trying to get in and then not do anything right away, but be ready to do something later, just gain access. So that's one, and we've talked about that recently. But now there's a whole other one, and that is artificial intelligence. I have a lot of fun with AI. I use ChatGPT and Claude quite often. They're great for me personally. I've had all sorts of fun with them, and they're really powerful tools. I've gotten a lot more done with them than I could have done otherwise. I love using these tools. But they can also be used against us. They can be used to find bugs, as we saw with Fable and this whole thing with Mythos. And it's really shortened the time between discovering these vulnerabilities and weaponizing them. It's literally gone for weeks or months maybe for bad guys to kind of figure out there's a vulnerability and try to find a way to exploit it, to days or even hours, which is one of the reasons I talked about that government directive to fix these serious bugs within 3 days. That's real. Like, it really needs to be that quick. And we have so many legacy systems out there that may be in our critical infrastructure that are going to be prime targets for these things. So you're probably thinking, okay, great, but what can I do about that? Well, a lot of these attacks are done through these proxy networks or with botnets. And that's where you come in. That's where your devices in your home get compromised and are unwitting patsies, useful digital idiots in these campaigns to attack infrastructure. So let me just put a fine point on this. It is possible right now that your router, your smart TV, some webcam, maybe a smart refrigerator, may be at this very minute actively harming someone else. And those attacks are technically coming from your house, leading back to you. So, again, what can we all do about this? Well, I've obviously been talking about security and privacy for like 10 years now. All the things that we've talked about in all that time really all still apply. It's just now there's much more of a sense of urgency. But in thinking about the 500th episode of the podcast in particular, and what I wanted to kind of do to commemorate that, I want more of us to help each other. And I want more of us to be thinking about our collective security and our collective privacy. A lot of the solutions are the same, but it's a different way of thinking about it, and maybe it changes priorities. And the July 4th angle on this, the U.S. 250th birthday, that other angle to this was that it's kind of making me, it's giving me some of these like patriotic vibes. And it makes me think about the old wartime campaigns, like planting a victory garden, or the scrap metal collection campaigns, or even turning off your lights and closing your blinds at night. There was also the famous loose lips sink ships slogan, which honestly can apply to data, private data. Back then, those were seen as patriotic ways for average citizens to do their part, helping everyone with these kind of small personal commitments and small sacrifices. So in the coming months, and with the 500th podcast coming up, I'm going to be doing a series of articles on how to be a good digital neighbor, a good digital citizen. I'm going to focus on the simplest, most effective ways, most of them free, to reduce the likelihood of our devices getting compromised, and also make us better able to handle it if that does happen. Less vulnerable, more resilient. And while all of these things will help you personally, the overarching purpose of these articles is going to be to improve our collective security and privacy. So, as I said in the article, we're all in this together, folks. Security and privacy are not just me things, they are we things. So let's work together, and we can make things better for all of us. So stay tuned, there'll be more articles and things about this in the coming months. There you go, your news and your tip of the week. All right, that's going to do it for this week. I hope everybody in the U.S. has a fun and safe 4th of July next weekend. On Thursday morning, my top patrons will get their Merlin's Musings private podcast. I'm going to be discussing some of these upcoming plans for the 500th celebration, which I am still working some of the details out on, but I think I know what I'm going to do. So I'll start sharing some of the thoughts on that with my top patrons on Thursday. So looking ahead, next week, we're going to be hearing from Nate Wessler, who is a lawyer at the ACLU, and we're going to be talking about device searches, in particular at the border, but not strictly at the border, and location tracking and some of these other things, mostly from a legal angle, but also obviously with some practical tips as well. And I've actually recorded several interviews since we last spoke even. I talked with Zach Whitaker. That was a lot of fun. I talked with somebody from Epic and some other great organizations. Those are all coming in the future. You're not going to want to miss those. And the 500th episode is coming up quickly. So stay tuned for more information about how I plan to celebrate that. And spoiler, it's going to involve you guys too. All right, that's it for this week. Take care, everybody. Stay safe out there. And until next week, as always, don't get caught with your drawbridge down.